open this up. Abstract number 4. What's going on with abstract number 4? What movement are they talking about there?
It's either structuralism or functionalism.
Yeah, actually, I think it's structuralism, but the way I like to actually just call it is in experimental psychology, and maybe for your notes, there have basically been 3 movements in experimental psychology. And did you guys get? It's pretty cheap. It's an old textbook. See if you can get the textbook. It should be $15, $20 tops. Introspection was really one of the first movements of trying to make psychology scientific. And I think I may have covered this in the cognitive neuroscience class. Did I, or did I? So do you remember, Brittany, what introspection was all about?
So say that you have a rose and someone asks you to smell it, and you say, oh, it smells sweet or whatever, and they think that, we all have the same opinion. We're all going to think it's sweet.
Exactly the case. So the first person who started really the first science, if you want to call it, and for your notes, the first science was a movement called introspection. And you want to write down the name of the person. His name was William Wundt, W-U-N-D-T, Wundt, in Germany. The book might even have Leipzig, Germany. And what Wundt tried to do, say, W-U-N-D-T. What Wundt tried to do was train people on how to perceive things. How does this smell? Is it sweet or does it smell X, Y, or Z? Train people to perceive the environment. Actually, the sensation and perception game from the last class I was teaching, perceive the acoustic environment. Can you hear anything now in this room? What is it we hear? The projector. He would try to train people to report out. What are you hearing? What are you, basically sensations? What are you perceiving here? He would try to train people to be scientific perceivers visually, acoustically, smell. And this was really the first movement in trying to make psychology a science. It was called, from my end, introspection. But what is this abstract saying about introspection? Is it a happy, we love introspection as science kind of thing here? Kindly, is this a happy-go-lucky introspection is really science?
No.
How would you interpret, what kind of message are you getting out of this?
That introspection was thought to be the only. I feel like I'm just reading what's up there. They thought it was the only thing that you could use to study psychology, and they were wrong.
So we were trying to study with introspection consciousness. But the problem with introspection is it was very subjective. For your notes, it was very subjective. You should write that down for your notes. Very subjective. A lot of self-report bias. One person's self-report could be different than another. And is that really science if it's all self-report? The answer is no. It's not scientific. It was the start. He tried to train people, but the first movement in experimental psychology was introspection. Actually, let me look at the book, because Brittany, you were correct that what did we say? Structuralism or functionalism? It's in there somewhere. We'll have some book pages to assign here. But introspection was the first one. This is saying, should we actually even be studying consciousness? If we want to be scientific, it's basically saying, no, don't study conscious things. We have to do what? We're trying to be scientific here. Introspection is self-report. Bias, we should be studying whom? Animals. Stimulus response. Behaviorism, in terms of experimental psychology, behaviorism was a step above introspection. It was the second main wave, if you wish. Sorry, I got a new car at the end of last semester because I flipped over my old one, and I have Sirius XM, and it's got first wave.
Oh, yeah, that's the 80s, isn't it?
Kind of 80s-ish. So if introspection was the first wave, behaviorism kind of replaced it. And in behaviorism, what did they want with behaviorism? If you're going to study, if you're going to make psychology a science, there needs to be laws. There need to be laws. We need to study animals. And what are the two schools of behaviorism? What did we say before, the two schools? Classical and operant conditioning. Let's talk a little bit about classical conditioning here. Who was the big shot with classical conditioning? Pavlov. Let's talk a little bit about Pavlov. You should know this, but you may not, but you'll want to write it down. Pavlov, what did he do at first?
The dogs and the saliva and the bowel tone.
There you go. Started off with a neutral stimulus, a tone, showed the food. The unconditioned stimulus led to the unconditioned response of what?
Salivating.
Salivating. But once you put the tone over and over again, the tone turns into what kind of stimulus?
Conditioned.
Conditioned stimulus, because that tone will lead to,
Conditioned response.
I'm getting kind of hungry. 5:15. Conditioned response, the salivation. So that was classical conditioning. So we're still back to the question, though, of what was going on with our study? Was this, and Skinner, what was Skinner's big deal? Skinner was all about operant conditioning.
The boxes.
The boxes and,
Chickens? No.
say again?
Was it chickens?
Wasn't quite chickens, a lot of rat studies, but it was reinforcement. You can change behavior by doing reinforcement. We're not going to get into memory yet. We shall. But the behaviorists were basically like, don't study memory because that's cognitive. We want to have things that we can observe and measure. This study that you did, would you say it falls more under classical conditioning or operant conditioning?
Classical.
It would actually be classical conditioning. We were trying to do learning here. I actually did something a little bit that I wasn't supposed to do. I was supposed to ask you to imagine something fearful. You can write that for your notes if you wish. I was supposed to ask you to imagine something fearful to begin with. And after asking you to imagine something fearful, that should cause what for you?
Anxiety.
Some anxiety. And so the idea, if you're having anxiety, now did anybody start? I was supposed to actually read that to you, but I didn't. Sorry about that. Mistakes are human. But if I had actually asked you to do that, the idea of pairing up anxiety with what? Meditation and visual imagery, those two stimuli, do they go together? Can you have both of those simultaneously? Can you be anxious and have relaxation at the same time?
No.
No. So we were actually doing a classical conditioning experiment. This was a classical conditioning experiment. It was classical conditioning. It was a visual imagery thing. and it was under classical conditioning.